I really appreciate everyone being here today. I'm Leah Scanlan. I'm the talent partner at Oak HCFT. And as many of you know, Oak's track record in healthcare investing is unparalleled, and we've continued to be at the forefront of healthcare innovation. At Oak, people have always been core to our investment philosophy. And one of the most important leaders in any of our healthcare portfolio companies is the person who's usually responsible for things like designing, orchestrating, and operating the clinical side of the business. And when we think about innovation in healthcare, one of the things we think about is pioneering new models of care. This typically requires utilizing clinicians in non-traditional settings and empowering them to work in new ways. And over the years, we've seen this new category of operational leader emerge, and in a specialization that's now called clinical operations or ClinOps. And one of the benefits of being a more specialized investment firm is that we get to see patterns emerge. And one of the patterns or questions that we continue to hear is around the role of clinical operations, and especially now in sort of the new and demanding environment, what does that mean? And so we've brought together three incredible leaders from our network for a virtual panel that's focused on the role of clinical operations and how to manage complex service organizations, especially in today's emerging times. So I really appreciate the three of you being here. I know your insights are going to be really valuable to sort of all, healthcare executives, and hopefully shine some spotlight on the value of having an excellent clinical leader in your business. So with that, I'd love to go around and make introductions. Maybe Lindsay, we start with you. Would love to hear a little bit about your background. Would be great just to hear about your career path and what led you to the position you're in today, and sort of a career in clinical operations.
My healthcare career has been focused in operations and strategy, with some transformation and entrepreneurship work thrown in for good measure. At heart, I really am a dyed-in-the-wool operator, which to me means that I most enjoy the intersection between people, relationships, and process. And I've spent time at DaVita Kidney Care, at DaVita Medical Group, and at Oak Street Health. Today, I serve as the Chief Clinical Operations and Learning Officer for Oak Street Health. We have elected to bridge those two worlds very purposefully. Oak Street Health is a rapidly growing company, and so ensuring best practice is present not only in our existing centers, but also in the many new centers that we activate every year, is key to our portfolio of activities and clinical operations.
Matthew, do you want to sort of introduce yourself? Would love to hear a little bit more about your background and sort of how you got to where you are today and the path and the position that you're in.
Sure. Thanks so much for having me. It's great to be here with an excellent panel. So my name is Matt Press. I am a general internist primary care physician at the University of Pennsylvania Health System. And my other role, in addition to seeing patients here, is as a physician executive of Penn Primary Care. That's our employed network of primary care practices. We have a little bit over 100 primary care practices, 500 or so physician and advanced practice provider clinicians. And in my role, I help oversee not only clinical operations, but also our population health management work related to our value contracts as we evolve our primary care network from a more traditional model to an advanced primary care model that's the centerpiece of our population health efforts. I started this role a little bit over 5 years ago, having just come out of a 3-year stint at CMS. I was one of the leaders of the CMS Innovation Center and helped design several new alternative payment models while I was there, and had really an outstanding experience there. Felt like we were making a tremendous impact on healthcare across the country, but I've yearned to be on the other side of the incentive, setting incentives as well, being on the receiving end of those incentives and really being able to help lead the transformation of care in response to new payment incentives. So that was why I made that transition. But having both lenses on the payer side and on the provider side has proved to be very useful in my clinical operations role.
I'm sure I could see why that would be. Well, I can see why having the dual sort of view would be so useful, especially being an MD yourself. So very different perspective, but it's why I think having the three of you here today is so exciting. Maureen, would love for you to sort of tell us a little bit about your path and where you are today and some of the stuff you've worked on.
My path in healthcare is a little bit different. I was actually a CPA early in my career, and it was after business school that I switched from an accounting background, working very closely with the doctors. And I was coming from a perspective of having zero knowledge of healthcare, nuances, anything else. And it was a matter of my finance background being valuable to the physicians. Then I went into revenue cycle consulting in particular, and then back into practice management. I spent 8 years at Privia, leaving there as Senior VP of Operations, where I was responsible for the onboarding, successful onboarding of all of our groups, as well as all things revenue cycle, credentialing, and all of that.
What are the things that you're typically responsible for as a clinical operations leader? How do you define that, or how do you come to decide what your clinical operations leader is going to be responsible for? Any tips or sort of experiences that might help to think about that differently?
Yeah, sure. I think clinical operations leader is different based on the kind of organization that you're talking about. If you're talking about a large academic practice center, clinical operations is often a dyad model with the physician leader and looking at all things, including staffing, finance, operations, efficiency, everything having to do with outcomes and reporting and payer relationships. All of those kinds of things fall into clinical operations in a variety of forms. If you're talking about a startup organization where organic growth is the key, or finding venture capital funds and things like that, you're looking at operating at scale, finding the efficiencies in the practices so that you can maximize EBITDA and really be attractive to investors. So it does fall into a couple of different, well, several groups maybe, but I think overall it encompasses the practice of the business side of medicine, and most appropriately, it's practiced in concert with the clinical side of medicine, be that the physicians, the advanced practitioners, and whomever.
That's great. I mean, Matthew, you've done this in a system. Do you have, I mean, have you seen this something similar, or what is your take, I guess, on sort of how you define clinical operations and the responsibility of someone, especially given your experience?
Yeah, I define clinical operations as anything that ultimately is going to affect the point of care. And that really is quite broad. So, we do have a dyad relationship. I have a administrative partner, and we, oversee clinical operations. But at the same time, sitting around the table is HR, finance, recruitment, IT, and really all of population health management. All of those pieces are affecting clinical operations. Each person has their own expertise, but I think we have a common focus, and that's what's going on at the point of care.
Yeah, makes sense. I mean, Lindsay, would you add to that or agree? You're nodding, so maybe agree with some of that.
Well, the beauty of clinical operations is that it's broadly defined. So many definitions fit depending on the ecosystem that you live in or that you're enabling. I think ultimately the common thread between various flavors of clinical operations is that we're very focused on the systems, to Dr. Press's point. The system in which we operate is what we are attempting to optimize. We're trying to design and implement solutions that ultimately result in application that improves the point of care, that improves clinical care, that improves patient experience, whatever the particular objective may be. I think everybody that's in clinical operations is very attuned to the systems that are working around us and how we might enhance them or configure them in ways that are of service to our teams and to our patients at the end of the day.
Right. I think you hit on some of this in sort of your definition of clinical operations, but are there hallmarks of a successful clinical operations leader that you've seen sort of rise above others? Are there hallmarks of the relationship with the broader organization that you feel like, that really stands out if you do it that way? Or, there are things about that relationship that really make for a stronger leader in that position?
Yeah, I think it boils down to collaboration and credibility. Dr. Press made the point, as did Maureen, that there's lots of stakeholders sitting at the table with clinical operations. And ultimately, in any of the organizations that we're a part of, we have lots of different groups of stakeholders that are looking to clinical operations to help them bring whatever innovations or enhancements or initiatives that the various departments are contemplating to bear in the care setting. So I work in a multi-state, multi-site healthcare environment and have lots of very thoughtful partners across all facets of the organization who are coming up with thoughtful new ways for us to both deliver the best care anywhere and to deliver a great experience and to have a great experience for our teams. And they turn to clinical operations to help them think about and design solutions that actually are implementable and applicable and sustainable in the centers. And so that's the collaboration piece, is working in tight partnership with others in the organization in pursuit of broader goals. And then on the credibility front, I think when it comes to designing solutions that work, clinical operations leaders need to really deeply understand how things work at the front lines of care, not how we imagine that they work. And those can be very different things. So clinical operations leaders really need to understand and empathize as they approach design thinking for new solutions. And that means that they spend a lot of time in the care setting. To Maureen's point about spending time in the operating room when she was beginning her healthcare career, we need to be sitting shoulder to shoulder with frontline caregivers to make sure that we're designing solutions that work.
Maureen, are there other hallmarks that you would add?
Sure, absolutely. And I agree, Lindsay, it's so critical to really understand the caregiver's perspective and to really appreciate the training where they've come from, and the ultimate care is of the patient. And so not only just this dyad model and working with the clinicians, but also with a focus on the patient. Additionally, I would say that any good leader in any organization, but most especially in clinical operations, I believe, because you have people's lives at stake, is to be a lifelong learner. And whether it is correcting from, a misstep or just additional certifications, if there's additional training, you can always learn something new. And sometimes it's outside of your comfort zone. So, sitting in grand rounds and listening to, some of the clinical things that are being discussed, it might point you to something that says, oh, wow, I think we can do this better. I think there's a different system. The frustration I'm hearing from the clinicians is X, and maybe we need to design it differently. So again, always being attuned to listening for clues or listening for opportunities and focusing on your own continuing education, I think is critical for any leader.
You all are a testament that you can find this in one person. But, Matt, when you think about finding leaders that are both kind of clinically competent and business savvy, right? You want to find the balance of those two things in one person, one leader. How do you think about going about finding that person or like striking that balance?
Yeah, I think having a clinical background does not necessarily guarantee you'll have that love, so to speak.
Right.
And not coming from a clinical background doesn't necessarily mean you won't have it. So, I've worked with outstanding leaders with no clinical background who have that commitment to patient care and quality and patient experience. And so I think, but we can also do things to cultivate that in our leaders, particularly now in such a challenging work environment in healthcare. I think it's really important that we sort of nourish the soul, to continue the metaphor of our employees and our operations leaders, so that they maintain that commitment and that passion. I think that, the more tools you can have, finance, payer, clinical, the more tools one person can bring to the table, the better. But this is absolutely a team sport. You absolutely have to have people who have more expertise in one area than the other, that can come together and complement each other.
Maureen, Lindsay, I'd ask you something similar, but maybe even take it a step further. Or, Matthew's making a great point, but I think part of that is, in this demanding time, you're going to have to strike the balance, but it's also, there's probably some teaching and educating that goes into this as well, or training and developing of people. Do you think that, can you teach or upskill a person, sort of a group, to learn both of those competencies? How do you think about like hiring for the key capability? Is there a key capability you're hiring for? Would love to hear sort of your opinions on that, because I do think that's one of the most challenging things that we're experiencing right now, is that we just don't have the supply.
Yeah, Leah, I'll take the start, and then I think you can hire for that. I always believe in the philosophy of hire smart people, give them challenge, give them support, and stand back and watch what happens. And it's not immediate maybe, but it is definitely possible. And I think what Dr. Press said is so true. If you have love for others and you want to do well, you'll find a way to do this. And I do believe there's so much education out there. There's companies that are committed to it, to developing leaders, because quite frankly, if you don't, you can't expect somebody to come in and know it all. So there has to be a level of learning that's expected in any job. But I think if you take that combination of just inquisitive, really smart people who are willing to admit what they don't know, and also willing to say, teach me. I would love to learn. And I think that comes from natural inquisitiveness in an individual, combined with support of the organization, and a little bit of patience too in developing people. But in the end, it's well worth it.
Yeah, I really love that inquisitiveness characteristic, or curiosity, because I think at the end of the day, back to this systems idea, and Maureen, you introduced this earlier, it's people who are willing to look for the clues and find ways to do things better in service of the people that we support and in service of our patients. The work that we do is a team-based sport, to steal from Dr. Press, and it's complicated. The healthcare is very, very complicated, which I think reinforces the need to really develop people from within, and to promote and to generate your pipeline, your talent pipeline internally as much as possible. One of the hardest things to find is people who really understand what it looks like at the front lines of care. And so once you have folks at the front lines of care who really understand the complexities of delivering great care every day, we want at Oak Street and in other places that I've worked to really support people's growth and development into future leadership roles, because they've already tackled one of the toughest pieces, which is figuring out how to make it all come together every day, which is really, really tricky. The other thing that I would call out is just a deep appreciation for the dyad model, which has been referenced multiple times today. Our model at Oak Street is to have every region led through dyad partnership and true equivalent dyad partnership. And we do that up and down the organization. We do it at the center level, we do it at the regional level, we do it at the divisional level, we do it at the organizational level. Because we really believe in that type of cross-pollination, and also the learning that occurs between clinicians and administrative or business people. I think the foundation is that deep appreciation, or the love that emanates from the quote that Dr. Press shared. But if we make sure that dyads are aligned, if their areas of focus overlap, if their incentives are the same, if you incentivize the administrative person on quality or elements of quality and business outcomes, and you do the same thing for their clinician partner, amazing things happen.
Yeah, I think that's so key. We see it in our companies and talk a lot about this as well. It's really finding that balance, and also I think making sure that you have a leader who is able to really speak to and resonate with clinicians, have empathy, right, and really sort of put themselves in that position while also being able to manage and teach, mentor, develop sort of operationally an organization. I think it is not the easiest thing to do, but it's something we strive for in many of our organizations that deal with this. And it's something we've pushed for and talk a lot about. So I love that we're hearing it here. It's no surprise to anyone, but I think, you just open up a newspaper, open up a website, and the number one thing people are talking about today is the staffing shortages, right? We are having a supply and demand issue across all sort of specialties and across the country. How is, from your own experiences today and maybe in the past, how do you weigh the trade-off between improvements to patient care versus improving staffing and efficiencies when you have an issue like the one that we're in today where the supply demand isn't exactly lining up? I don't know, Matthew, do you want to start maybe?
Yeah, I mean, it's a challenging time that we're in terms of staffing, particularly at the front line of care. One approach that we've taken is cross-training our frontline staff to be able to play multiple roles in the clinical setting. So, for instance, in a primary care practice, that might look like a medical assistant who can room patients, but part of that rooming process is also going to be closing care gaps related to our population health management efforts, and as well as the skill set and training to be able to work the front desk or work the phone system so that we have that kind of flexibility. The other thing we've done is we've grouped our practices at a regional level, and we're unlike Lindsay's organization that started de novo, we sort of over time, many decades, inherited a large primary care network, and so had to work backwards a bit. And the approach that we've taken is to group practices regionally so that they can also share staff. If one practice is down staff, they have some cross coverage abilities across those practices. Same goes for our population health management team. They cover at a regional level. They're primarily anchored in a single practice to develop the relationship with those clinicians and those patients in that practice, but they sort of report up at a regional level to allow that flexibility. So it's still tough, but I think building in some cross coverage and versatility has been helpful.
Lindsay, have you seen something similar?
Yeah, it has been a very challenging year in the labor market, particularly in healthcare. We've done lots of different things. We've, like many, looked at compensation and incentive structures at the height of the issue. And the other thing that we've just really focused on is investing in teams. So we don't have as much ability to necessarily pull resource between centers. We're committed to optimizing our impact by continuing to grow and meeting unmet needs in the communities we serve. So we've been looking to continue serving and finding solutions to do that. That really has looked like doubling down on our investment in our teams and listening very closely to what they need in order to make it work when they're, down a colleague in the center. And the work is getting farmed out between various folks until we can get the next person in. We try to avoid those situations as much as possible, but ultimately, at the end of the day, and back to where I started, clinical operations has to be grounded in making work easier and more simple for our teams. We've got to deliver great processes. We've got to deliver best practices. We have to deliver the right tools that they can fall back on in those moments of challenge to make it through, to bridge, to the next nurse or to bridge to the next medical assistant that we might be down. It also takes a lot of patience on the part of everybody, which is very hard to come by these days. But ultimately, we want to make sure that our team feels invested in and supported so that when we're in these really tough moments, as we have been over the course of the year, they know that they have the tools at their disposal to help bridge that gap.
I think if I had an audience of our CEOs here live, one of the questions they'd want me to ask, because I think it's a tough one to answer, but something that many of them, come to us with is, how do you optimize labor economics against acuity of the need?
We probably take a slightly different lens at Oak Street, given that we are a risk-based organization. We invest very heavily in a totally differentiated type of team that can deliver the type of preventative outcomes that we need in order to pull cost out of the healthcare system. So what we are constantly looking at is probably different than much of medicine or much of healthcare. At the end of the day, though, when we think about whether we're going to invest in a new role that we have in our centers, which don't exist in many primary care centers, we're very specific about what the return on investment is and do the best that we can to tie that to the downstream impact of delivering medicine, delivering clinical care that prevents more acute, more costly episodes from occurring down the line. So our ratio looks different and our analysis looks different probably than many other healthcare entities. But at the end of the day, I love our labor economic model because if we can deliver the right results for patients, we're willing to make the investment in incremental headcount, which is why you'll find so many more roles and people in an Oak Street Health Center than you might find in a more traditional care setting.
Right. And Matthew, you probably have a very different vantage point. Would love to hear sort of your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, not actually that different in the sense that we are on a rapid transformation towards value. And so, going through sort of similar calculations on what is that return on investment in a value setting, it turns out it's much harder to make that calculation than it is in a fee-for-service setting. In a fee-for-service setting, you can say X input is going to produce Y widgets. That's a lot harder to do in a value setting. And so again, I would go back to that continuous quality improvement approach. This is new territory for all of us. And so the more learning and the more rapidly we can do that learning, and the more we can then share that learning, I think the better we all will do to understand what are the high yield investments, particularly in a value type care model.
Maureen, is there anything else you'd add to that?
No, I would just echo these comments, and it's a matter of front loading costs. Oftentimes in a value-based world, you get paid in arrears basically for the work that you do today. So you're not necessarily offsetting revenue and expense at the same time, but rather you're sort of front loading the cost, and it can be very challenging, especially if in the end the contracts don't pay like you thought they would, or you've missed some mark and you don't get the realization of the income that you were planning based on the staffing model that you had. So it is a very challenging time right now as value-based care is really getting more and more developed and more ramped up. It's not as prevalent, I think, as most clinicians, maybe. If I could speak for Dr. Press, I don't know what your comments would be on whether or not we really have made it to the value-based care optimal level. I don't think that we have, but there's a tremendous amount of cost into it. But I think in the end, it can be very, very helpful, and I think it'd be profitable once we get to that point. But we're not there yet, I don't believe.
Would love any quick sort of lightning round thoughts that you might have before we sign off. Matthew, do you want to start?
Sure. I think one of the biggest challenges of clinical operations is that it can be all-consuming in the moment. The things that come up day to day because of the seriousness of what we're delivering can really be all-consuming, and that comes at the detriment of the longer-term view of where we want to where we want our operational model to be. So I think it's really critical to try to protect in some way that ability of the operator to see where the puck is going, kind of metaphor, and build that model for the future without obviously neglecting the immediate and urgent things that come up day to day. It's a tough balance to find, but I think that's really critical for our clinical operations teams.
Awesome. Maureen?
Yeah, I would agree. Clinical operations is ever evolving. And as our healthcare environment evolves, so does clinical operations. And what used to be the case 10 or 15 years ago is not likely the case today. And so flexibility, inquisitiveness, efficiencies, building teams at scale that can sustain these periods where we have some downtime and or downturn in the labor market is really critical, with the ultimate goal, obviously, of providing the best clinical care for the patients that we serve.
I would just add in that I hope that the broad definitions around clinical operations are not a stressor, but actually a releaser for folks who are in earlier stage ventures. In particular, clinical operations is there to serve and address your most pressing needs. And although it can be very broadly defined, I think one of the most important things to keep in mind, based on whatever the stage of venture, enterprise, or effort you're in, is to be ruthless in your prioritization about what clinical operations is going to tackle in any given moment and what the roadmap to success looks like. Because it's so broadly defined, it's very easy to put a lot in the container. But if you're not very specific and aligned across the organization about what clinical operations is going to prioritize or focus on in what sequence or order, it's easy to get nothing done. So prioritization and developing a team and a model that can consume more and do more over time and to graduate with your priorities is really important.
You're speaking our language. I really appreciate your time, guys. This has been amazing. Thank you so much for everything today. I appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.